My name is Evelyn. I'm 66 years old, a retired high school English teacher, and a widow. I live in a small white house just outside Portland, Oregon, the one Charles and I moved into 40 years ago when our son was still in grade school. Charles passed away 3 years ago after a long illness. I was with him every day. I held his hand through treatments, appointments, and the long, quiet moments in between. He was the kind of man who fixed things that didn't even look broken. After he died, I tried to keep fixing things too, mostly myself. This morning, I stood by the window watching a pair of finches hop across the back fence. It was my granddaughter Lily's wedding day. I had spent the past 6 months helping her plan it mostly from the background. I covered the venue, the florist, and that little indie quartet she loved from college. It brought me joy. She called me her anchor, said I made things feel possible. I had picked out a pale lavender dress the night before, something soft but elegant. I still remembered how Charles used to say that color lit up my face. I smiled thinking of him as I clipped on the silver earrings he gave me on our 30th anniversary. Then I made tea, sat at the kitchen table, and looked at the card Lily had sent with the final wedding schedule. It was printed with lilacs and a handwritten note at the bottom. "Can't wait to see you, Grandma." I held on to that for a moment. The house was quiet except for the soft sound of the kettle cooling. I thought about how rare it is for a day to begin so gently. I should have known the stillness meant something was coming. But that's the thing about the quiet. It doesn't warn you. It just waits. By 9:30, I was in the car driving toward the West Grove Inn where the ceremony would be held. I passed the old park where Charles and I used to sit after Sunday breakfast. The memories came like a soft tide. Not overwhelming, but steady. I felt grateful to still feel him near even when I was alone. I parked under a row of sycamores and sat in the car a moment before stepping out. The sky was bright. No clouds, the kind of day people wish for when they set wedding dates. I smoothed my dress, checked my hair in the mirror, and gathered my purse. Then I walked slowly toward the entrance, thinking only of Lily. I was proud. I felt full. I didn't know I was about to feel something else entirely. The lobby smelled faintly of citrus and fresh orchids. I walked slowly toward the check-in table where two young women in matching navy dresses stood behind a clipboard and a display of name tags. Everything was polished and bright like a magazine spread. I smiled, ready to introduce myself, still carrying that quiet pride from the drive over. One of the women looked up and greeted me with a cheerful tone. She asked for my name, flipping through a stack of cards neatly arranged in alphabetical order. I said it clearly. Evelyn Moore. She smiled again, pulled a tag from the stack, and handed it to me without hesitation. I took it with one hand, eyes scanning the gold-trimmed lettering. My breath caught. It didn't say Evelyn. It didn't say grandmother of the bride. It said old lady paying for everything. My fingers stiffened around the edge of the card, and for a moment I thought maybe I'd read it wrong. The woman must have noticed something shift in my face because she leaned forward, voice softer now, asking if something was wrong. I swallowed and tried to keep my voice steady. I told her I thought there might have been a mistake. She glanced at the card again, blinking. "Oh no, let me check if there's another one," she said. I shook my head gently and forced a smile. "It's all right. I'll speak with my family." My voice sounded too calm, like someone else's. I pinned the name tag to my dress and turned away before she could respond. The walk from the lobby to the ballroom felt longer than it was. Each step seemed to echo. I kept my posture straight, my expression soft. Inside, something was beginning to slip. I pushed open the ballroom doors and was met with golden lights music and the kind of laughter that floats just above the surface of champagne glasses. Lily stood near the center, radiant in white lace, surrounded by bridesmaids and her new husband's family. She looked happy. Everyone did. Servers moved between clusters of guests offering hors d'oeuvres. There was a string quartet tucked into the corner, playing just the way Lily had asked. I paid for them myself. I searched the room for someone who might notice me, acknowledge me, maybe even hug me. But no one turned. I moved slowly toward an empty seat near the back past tables, with place cards and framed photos of Lily and her fiancé at college, at the beach, on a ski trip I hadn't known about. I sat alone and looked down at the name tag on my chest. The letters shimmered beneath the chandelier light. Old lady paying for everything. I reached up and adjusted it slightly, hoping no one else would notice what it said, though. Part of me knew they already had. I thought about how much time I'd spent helping Lily get to this day. I thought about the checks I'd written, the calls I'd taken late at night, the way I had offered without being asked. It wasn't about the money, it never had been. It was about wanting to be useful, to feel included, to be loved in the way I had loved. A waiter passed by and offered me sparkling water. I nodded, thanked him quietly, and sipped slowly. All around me, the celebration grew louder. Toasts began, laughter echoed. A photographer knelt to get a better angle of the cake being wheeled into the room. No one asked me to join the family photo. I watched as Lily clinked glasses with her friends, her eyes full of light. I didn't expect her to sit beside me all night, but I hadn't expected this either. To be invisible in a room I helped build, to be tagged and labeled like a transaction. I thought about Charles, how he used to squeeze my hand in moments like this, how he'd remind me I mattered. I touched my left hand gently, remembering that weight, that warmth. I missed him so much in that moment it physically hurt. A woman at the next table glanced at me, then looked away quickly. Maybe she had read the name tag, maybe she hadn't. It didn't matter. What mattered was that I had. And the moment I saw those words, something shifted. Quietly, irrevocably. That night would keep playing in my mind for days to come. Not just because of the tag, but because it was the first time I truly saw how my family saw me. Not as a mother, not as a woman, but as a resource. And the saddest part was that I had let them. I had handed over that version of myself without realizing what it cost. As the first dance began, I stood and walked slowly toward the back of the room. No one noticed, not even Lily. I slipped outside away from the music and into the cool night air. I stood alone under a string of patio lights and closed my eyes. For a long time, I didn't move. That was the night I stopped pretending. That was the night I stopped giving without asking what I was being given in return. Not money, not thanks, just simple respect. And from that night on, everything began to change. The first time Tom asked for help, it didn't feel like asking. He and Claire had invited me over for dinner, cooked a beautiful meal, poured my favorite wine, and spent the evening talking about Charles. It felt good to be included, to sit at their table and hear his name spoken with warmth. Near the end of the night, Tom mentioned how their kitchen cabinets were falling apart. Nothing extravagant, he said, just new counters, maybe a better stove. Claire chimed in with a soft laugh, saying the kids deserved a space that worked. I didn't hesitate. I wrote the check the next morning, telling myself Charles would have done the same. It didn't feel like a burden. It felt like love, like I was still part of something that needed me. A few months later, there was talk of tuition, then braces, then Claire's car started breaking down. I told myself these were just life's little storms, and I was lucky to have the means to help them stay dry. Each time their thanks came with a smile and a hug, it felt good, until it didn't. Looking back now, I see how slowly it crept in, like ivy around the edges of a house. The requests became less gentle, more like expectations. And when I paused or hesitated even briefly, I saw something change in their eyes. Not frustration exactly, but something close. There were weekends they brought over the kids and left them with me while they went away. I told myself I loved the time with my grandkids, and I did. But the way Tom spoke, it felt less like a favor and more like a schedule being handed down, as if I owed them my time as well. Claire started texting about birthday parties and upgrades to the house. Nothing huge, just little things. A chocolate fountain for Lily's Sweet 16, a new patio set before the summer barbecue, each thing small on its own, but together they formed a weight I didn't know I was carrying. I told myself this was family, that giving was a way to stay close. But sometimes after they left, I'd find myself sitting alone in my kitchen, unsure of how much I had given. Not just the checks, but the quiet, the part of me that kept saying yes. There were no arguments, no slammed doors, just slow, subtle drift. I started to wonder if they would visit at all if I stopped giving. I hated that thought. I hated myself for thinking it. I kept a box of bank statements in the hallway closet. I never looked at them. I told myself I didn't need to, that it didn't matter. But deep down, I think I was afraid of what the numbers would show. Not just in dollars, but in how far I had gone without stopping to ask why. They kept calling me generous, said Charles would be proud. I wanted to believe them. I wanted to believe I was still giving from a place of love. But little by little, something inside me began to question. And once that question formed, it never really went away. The morning after the wedding, I was still in my robe, sitting at the kitchen table with that name tag beside my cup of tea. I hadn't taken it off the dress until late the night before. It sat there now like a piece of evidence, and I couldn't bring myself to throw it away. The house was quiet. Outside, the sky was gray and soft with early light. I hadn't slept much. I kept replaying the way Lily laughed with her friends, the way no one saw me leave. I wasn't angry yet. just tired. Then the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. I peered through the window and saw a man in a gray coat standing on my porch with a leather folder under one arm. When he turned slightly, I recognized him. David Harding, Charles's attorney for more than 2 decades. He was the one who guided us through the estate paperwork when Charles passed, always respectful, always discreet. I opened the door surprised. He greeted me softly, almost apologetically. I remember he looked past me and saw the name tag on the table, but he didn't mention it. Instead, he stepped inside and said he had something Charles had left behind, something he was instructed to deliver if and only if he felt the time was right. He pulled a sealed envelope from his folder and handed it to me with both hands. The weight of it surprised me. I didn't open it right away. I just stared at the handwriting on the front. Charles's handwriting. The way he wrote my name. My fingers trembled as I opened it. The letter inside was brief, formal. Not like a love note, more like a safeguard. A clause, David explained, added quietly into our family trust just weeks before Charles passed. It stated that any direct descendant who publicly humiliated or manipulated me would forfeit their share of the inheritance. No appeal, no warning, just a final line drawn in black and white. I sat back in my chair. My hand still held the letter, but I couldn't feel them. David didn't speak. He just waited. I looked up at him and finally asked why Charles never told me. David said he believed Charles didn't want me to worry, that he hoped the clause would never be needed. But after what happened at the wedding, David said he felt it was time, that Charles had seen something in our family shifting, a kind of erosion he couldn't stop but tried to prepare for. I stared down at the paper again. My name, my protection. It was all there, notarized and legal, but more than that, it was personal. It was Charles reaching back across time, trying to hold me upright. I didn't cry. Not right away. I just sat with it, and for the first time since the wedding, I didn't feel quite so alone. Not because the clause would change anything today, but because it proved that someone had seen me, had seen what I gave, what I carried, and cared enough to guard it. David placed a hand on mine. He asked what I wanted to do. I folded the letter and handed it back to him, telling him, not yet. I wasn't ready. I needed to understand if what happened was a mistake or something deeper. He nodded, said he'd be nearby if I needed him. Then he left just as quietly as he came. I sat in that chair for a long time after. The letter still echoed in my chest. It didn't erase the pain, but it gave it shape, and somehow that made it easier to bear. The brunch was held at the country club just outside town, the kind of place with crisp linen napkins and soft piano music looping in the background. I almost didn't go. I told myself I was too tired, but really, I was still raw from the wedding, still carrying that name tag in my purse like a bruise. But something told me I needed to go. Maybe I was looking for clarity. Maybe I was hoping it had all been a misunderstanding. I wore a cream pantsuit Charles always said made me look like royalty. As I stepped into the dining room, I scanned the crowd and spotted Lily and her husband laughing at a table near the back. Everyone looked cheerful, untouched by the undercurrent still tugging at my chest. Tom waved me over to the head table. Claire kissed my cheek with a compliment about my outfit, her eyes flicking toward my neckline, clearly searching for pearls I hadn't worn. I smiled politely. They seated me beside Mark's parents, people I barely knew. It felt intentional, subtle but unmistakable. Midway through brunch, Claire tapped her glass with a spoon. Her voice rose above the murmur of the room as she thanked everyone for making the wedding weekend so special. Then she turned to me with a practiced smile and said how grateful they all were for my generosity. I nodded, uncomfortable but composed. Then she said something I hadn't expected, that I would be gifting Lily and Mark a 2-week honeymoon in Bali. There was a ripple of polite applause. I sat there stunned, my coffee cup frozen halfway to my lips. I had never promised that. Tom leaned toward me, whispering that they had already told the couple. Just go with it, he said. I set the cup down and spoke clearly. This is the first I'm hearing of it. The room went still. Lily looked confused. Mark stared at his plate. Claire gave a nervous laugh, brushing it off, saying I had said I'd think about it. I kept my voice even. I did say I'd think about it, and I still am. Tom's smile vanished. Don't make a scene, Mom. I looked at him and spoke just above a whisper. I don't recall agreeing to pay for an international honeymoon. I believe Mark's parents were covering that. Mark's father cleared his throat, muttering something about financial setbacks. These things happen, I said gently, but it's inappropriate to publicly offer someone else's money. Claire's voice sharpened. Well, you're not exactly broke. That landed like a slap. The assumption in her tone, the entitlement. My financial choices are not for public discussion, I said. Tom reached for my arm. You're embarrassing us. I pulled my arm back. No, I said quietly. You embarrassed yourselves. Then I stood, adjusted my jacket, and walked out. No one followed me. I stepped into the hallway and kept walking until I reached the parking lot. My heels clicked against the pavement, a steady rhythm that felt almost like music. For the first time in years, I didn't look back. I got into my car and sat for a moment before starting the engine. My hands were shaking, but it wasn't fear. It was release. I had said what needed to be said. I had drawn a line, not in anger, in truth, and that was the moment I began to come back to myself. When I got home from the brunch, I slipped off my shoes and sat at the kitchen table without turning on the lights. The name tag was still in my purse. I didn't take it out. I didn't need to see it to feel the weight of what had just happened. But I didn't cry. That surprised me. There was no trembling, no aching grief like I'd expected, just a stillness. Not empty, but clear. I poured myself a glass of water and stared out the window into the backyard. The garden beds were overgrown, the roses barely holding their shape. I hadn't touched them in months, maybe longer. I used to tend them with care, planting each row by season, but somewhere along the way, I stopped making space for that kind of quiet work. That afternoon, I opened the hallway closet and pulled out the old box of bank statements. I had avoided it for years, told myself the past didn't matter, only the love behind it. But love I was starting to see should not cost a person their dignity. I laid the papers out on the table. Tuition checks home, upgrades, party vendors, and yes, the chocolate fountain. I read them all, slowly, not with bitterness, just with open eyes. It wasn't about the money. It was about the pattern. The way each act of giving had chipped away at something inside me, something I hadn't noticed going missing until it was gone. I had confused being needed with being loved. I had let my silence be mistaken for approval, and that silence had built the very structure they now used to lean on me. But now I saw it, not with anger, with certainty. I wasn't broken, I wasn't bitter, I was just done. Done letting guilt decide how I spent my days. Done watching them speak for me, plan for me, assume they had the right. From that moment on, I knew something had changed. I wasn't going to raise my voice, I wasn't going to plead, I didn't need to. There's a kind of power in quiet that most people underestimate, and I was ready to live in that power, not for revenge, but for peace, for myself. The next few weeks passed in quiet waves. I found myself rising earlier, drawn to the garden before the heat of the day settled in. The soil was dry in places, stubborn in others, but I worked it slowly, row by row. I trimmed the rose bushes that had gone wild, pulled weeds that had taken root without permission. The rhythm of it felt familiar, like something my body remembered better than my mind. Some mornings I would pause with my gloves still on, watching the bees drift between blossoms. There was a comfort in that kind of stillness. Not loneliness, just space. I hadn't realized how badly I needed that space until it was mine again. Inside the house, I moved through each room with more care. I dusted the corners I had ignored, donated boxes of things I no longer wanted. I lit candles at night just for myself, made small meals that tasted the way I remembered from years ago when I used to cook for joy, not obligation. I started reading again. Not just newspapers or bills, but real books. Novels I had loved in college. Stories I used to assign to my students. I let myself get lost in them, not because I needed to escape, but because I had finally slowed down enough to feel present. Then one afternoon, Michael stopped by. He stood on the porch with his hands in his pockets, eyes a little uncertain. I welcomed him in, offered him tea. We sat in the kitchen, the same place where I had once stared at that name tag. But this time, the air felt different. He looked around, then at the papers still spread across the table. I told him I'd been sorting through things, organizing a bit. He nodded quiet. Then he told me he was worried. He had overheard Tom and Claire talking about selling my house, said they thought it was time I moved into one of those retirement communities, said the upkeep was too much, that I was living in the past. I listened, not defensive, not even surprised, just still. I poured him another cup of tea and thanked him for telling me. He looked at me carefully, like he was searching for something in my expression. I think he expected me to get upset, but I didn't, because I already knew. I had felt that pressure building for years, always cloaked in concern, but hearing it out loud from Michael only confirmed what I had already decided. My home was not a burden. It was my sanctuary. I told him gently that I was okay, that I wasn't ready to let go of this place. Not the house, not the garden, not the life I had built with Charles. He nodded. There was something in his eyes that softened. Maybe it was understanding. Maybe it was respect. He didn't push. He just sat with me for a while longer, sipping tea, asking about the books I'd been reading. When he left, I watched him walk to his car and felt a quiet pride. Not just in him, but in myself. Because for the first time in years, I wasn't bending to keep the peace. I wasn't trying to prove my worth, I was just living. And the garden outside blooming little by little felt like proof that even things long neglected can grow again. Michael called the week before my birthday and said he wanted to host a dinner. Just family, he told me. Something simple. I could tell by the firmness in his voice that he had something more in mind. So I agreed. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't dread the idea of everyone gathering under my roof. I actually wanted it. The morning of the dinner, I worked in the garden early. The roses had come back strong. I clipped a few to place on the table. The scent of them filled the house. Inside, I cleaned with care, not to impress anyone, but because I wanted the house to feel whole. The kitchen smelled like fresh bread. I laid out the good dishes, the ones I hadn't used since Charles's last birthday. Then I pulled out a dress I had never worn. It was red, bold, a little daring, something I bought years ago and kept tucked in the back of the closet thinking it was too loud for someone my age. But that afternoon it felt just right. I took my time with my makeup, brushed my hair back the way Charles liked. As I looked in the mirror, I didn't see someone trying to prove anything. I saw a woman standing in her own story. Guests began arriving just after 5. Tom and Claire were first smiles, stiff and practiced. Tom handed me flowers from the grocery store. Claire's eyes swept over my dress like she didn't know what to make of it. I thanked them and showed them in. Lily and Mark followed a little late but cheerful. Then came Michael carrying a pie box and something softer in his expression. Behind him, a few of Charles's old friends filtered in, warm and familiar. The dining room buzzed with polite conversation. Glasses clinked, plates passed. But underneath it all, I felt it. A tension, a pause waiting to be filled. Everyone was watching in their own way, watching me, watching each other. I moved through it calmly, refilling drinks, offering seconds, smiling just enough. When we sat for dessert, I caught Michael's eye. He gave me the smallest nod. It wasn't much, but it told me I wasn't the only one ready for what came next. We were halfway through dessert when Tom cleared his throat and stood. Claire placed her hand on his arm as if to steady him, but she looked more rehearsed than worried. He said they needed to talk about something important, something about my well-being. I sat down my fork and folded my hands in my lap. He said I'd been giving away money irresponsibly, that I was becoming isolated, that it might be time to assign someone power of attorney for my own protection. Claire added that this wasn't an attack, just concern, that managing a house at my age was too much, that selling it could really help everyone involved. The room was quiet, only the sound of forks resting on plates. I didn't look at anyone but Tom. I asked if they had any evidence that I was unwell, any proof that I wasn't thinking clearly. Tom fumbled. Claire said something vague about recent decisions that didn't align with reality. That's when David, seated at the end of the table, set down his coffee cup and spoke. He said any legal change to my estate required documentation and cause. He asked again if they had evidence. They didn't. I stood then, calm, steady. I said I wasn't irrational, I wasn't confused, I was simply finished letting other people control my life. Tom said I was overreacting. Claire called me dramatic. I didn't flinch. I reminded them of everything I had done, the remodels, the tuition, the trips. I had done it quietly, lovingly, and they had taken every bit of it without a second thought. Tom asked if I was cutting them off. I said no. I was reclaiming what had always been mine, my voice. David reached into his case and pulled out the envelope, the same one he had shown me after the wedding. He read the clause aloud, the one Charles had written, the one that said anyone who manipulated or humiliated me would lose their share of the estate. Gasps spread across the table. Claire's face paled. Tom looked like he had been slapped. David turned to me, asked if I wished to enforce it. I looked at my son, my daughter-in-law, my granddaughter, then finally at Michael. He didn't say a word, but he nodded once, slow and steady. I said yes. Tom dropped into his chair. Claire whispered something under her breath. Lily stared at her hands. I stood straighter, not with pride, but with peace. Because this time, I wasn't just protecting myself, I was ending a cycle that had gone on too long. And I meant every word. A year later, my life is quieter, not empty, just settled in a way that feels good, like the end of a long exhale. Michael opened his bookstore downtown last spring. It's inside a restored Victorian house with tall windows and warm wood floors. He named it Chapter 1. The name still makes me smile. There's a small coffee bar in the back where his girlfriend Emma serves cinnamon scones and dark roast coffee. I come in twice a week to read to the children. The storytime corner is my favorite part. Soft beanbags in every color, shelves low enough for tiny fingers to reach. I painted a mural on the wall myself, trees with birds tucked in their branches, fairy homes and mushrooms, animals peeking through the leaves. It's the kind of place that invites you to stay. Parents linger with their drinks while the kids settle into story time. Sometimes when I look up from a book, I see Michael standing in the doorway watching me. There's something in his expression that makes my chest ache in the best way, a kind of quiet pride. Upstairs, the old apartment now hosts a writer-in-residence program. Michael used part of his inheritance to set it up. He says it's for voices that deserve to be heard. I think it's his way of building a legacy that speaks back to everything we went through. Back at home, my days have a new rhythm. I tend the garden again. The roses bloom fuller than they have in years. I bake bread in the afternoons just because the smell fills the house with something soft and steady. The rooms feel lighter now, not because I've changed the furniture, but because the weight that once filled the air is gone. There are no more whispered suggestions about selling. No more guilt baked into every favor. Jennifer visits often. She brings her baby girl, Charlotte. She named her after Charles. The first time I held Charlotte, I cried. Not from sadness, but from something that felt bigger than words. A circle closing, a new beginning. Sometimes Jennifer apologizes again for not speaking up sooner. And every time I tell her the same thing. You're here now. That's what counts. Tom and Claire moved to Florida. After David enforced the clause in the will, they tried to fight it, but it didn't go anywhere. The silence that followed was loud at first. A few strained Christmas cards, a missed birthday call, but in time, the quiet settled into something easier to carry. I don't wish them harm, I just wish them far away. And for now, that's enough. Last summer, I took a trip to Italy with a senior tour group. 2 weeks of cobbled streets, gelato, and slow dinners under string lights. On the last night watching the sunset over the Arno River in Florence, I met Frank. He's a retired architect from Boston with dry humor and kind eyes. We talk every Sunday now, nothing serious, but it feels good to have someone ask how my week was, and really mean it. Charles would have liked Frank, not just for his steady presence, but because he reminds me to live, to say yes when it matters. I used to think legacy was about money or names on plaques, but I see it differently now. Legacy is the stories we pass down, the way we make others feel, the strength to say no when we must, and yes when it counts. The bookstore hums with new life. Charlotte babbles from her stroller as Jennifer browses the shelves. Upstairs, a young writer finishes her manuscript. I pour tea and smile to myself. This, I think, is peace. Not the absence of hardship, but the presence of choice, the sound of your own voice steady in your chest, the quiet knowing that you came back to yourself. And if you're listening to this, and you've ever been taken for granted, if you've ever felt invisible in your own story, let this be your sign. You are allowed to change the ending. Because sometimes the softest revenge is simply becoming whole again. If you've ever been made to feel small for speaking your truth, I want you to hear this. Kindness is not weakness, and silence is not something you owe to those who chip away at your worth. It took me years to understand that setting boundaries doesn't make you ungrateful. It makes you whole. Love without respect is just dependence wearing a mask. If you're carrying the weight of keeping everyone happy while forgetting yourself in the process, you are not alone. You have every right to step out of that pattern. You have every right to say no. Your voice matters, your peace matters, and it's never too late to reclaim both. So if you've been waiting for a sign, let this be it. Stand up gently, choose peace firmly, and trust that becoming yourself again is more than enough. Because you don't owe anyone your silence, you owe yourself your life.